All right, well, let's get started. And thank you for joining our webinar today. We're going to talk about bugs, really pest and integrated pest management. Primarily, I know we're going to focus a little bit on the attention today is insect bites and related to carcass damage and preventing trim loss and carcass damages. And really, it's a much broader issue than that, although we're going to hone in on that piece of it that's related to skin lesions and so forth associated with carcass damage. And, first of all, I think we think a lot about bugs or pests and insects as firstly a personal nuisance a lot of times, whether it's at the family dinner table, whether it's in the farm office, or even in the barn environment to us as workers or employees or neighbors. And maybe it's at your favorite fishing hole, mosquitoes and gnats that bother you, even at the ballpark, right? Nobody enjoys them, and we certainly call them a pest or a pest for that region, for that reason. But certainly a much broader issue when it comes to livestock production in relation to potentially carcass damages and skin lesions situations, but also health, well-being concerns, and pathogen transfer. So, Chris, let me introduce ourselves. Colin Johnson. I'm one of 5 regional swine field specialists for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, working with producers and industry from an extension standpoint. In that regards. And Dr. Rademacher, you want to introduce yourself? You can do so.
Yeah, you bet. I'm Chris Rademacher. I'm a clinical professor here at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Iowa State University. I also serve as the associate director here at the Iowa Pork Industry Center, and sure glad you're joining us today.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. And we've got some great cases that have been brought to us here in recent years that Chris is going to bring forward to you. But let me introduce the issue just a little bit. In regards to, we're going to talk about flies and all the families and species of flies and its impact from an insect standpoint, but it's also important to alert ourselves that not all skin lesions and lesions, and whether it's vesicle, whether it's an exudative condition, whether it's something pathological or transmissible or not, there's a lot of symptoms that can occur. And some of them certainly do lead to trim loss, such as injuries, right? Or frostbite conditions. Really, if you want to see a carcass that looks like it's really bruised up, that may be a condition of a frostbite in transport. But got a list here of several things. Some of these are conditions that are transmissible. They are pathological. On your left-hand side, diseases that can exist in the industry. Insect bites are usually pretty discreet in the fact that they cause some really multifocal, red, slightly elevated, discrete lesions, papules, I guess you would say. Other conditions look different on the skin a lot of times, whether it's a vesicle such as Seneca virus, or more importantly, a foreign animal disease condition that Lord willing never steps foot on U.S. soils, right? But certainly can be there. Erysipelas is obviously a disease been around for centuries, one that causes kind of those diamond-shaped skin lesions that are subsurface areas. You've got things like greasy pig and PDNS that really those create crusty and kind of necrotic areas on the skin. Fortunately, a lot of those are earlier in life and they recover. That skin of a pig, much like the human skin, is very resilient and it's quick growing, so we can overcome it. So there's some other things on that list there. You've got lice, mange, ringworm. Those are really parasitical fungal conditions. Less common, I would say, in our industry today, but they still exist in some environments, right? And we can control those conditions fairly easily. But there are a number of them. The main thing to take note of is that don't always assume that you know what the condition is, right? So let's say we've had some Seneca situations in some barns in our system, and so we start to see a vesicle development or a skin, and we assume that, well, Seneca's going through here. Well, in the day and age of foreign animal diseases floating around, or even in the 90s we called PRRS mystery swine disease, right? What is the next condition that might be coming through that we would see dermatologically. So the key is get some veterinary guidance in there if we're questionable about it, especially if it's occurring on more than an individual or two here and there. So Chris, next slide. We generally think about, fly and bug season in the upper Midwest as really a summer thing, kind of that May to October. In the South, it may be, or coastal regions, it's a year-long condition, right? That we deal with, and naturally, these bugs overwinter as larvae in breeding areas kind of below our frost line, and so they're here all year. And when we get to temperatures at 50 degrees and above, it starts to create some slow development. Things like house flies can reside in the barn and breed there all year long. But from an impact to our industry, it's important to note, I think, that when we get into conditions where fly species get into barns and cause some biting conditions, we do know that trim loss can be as much as $7.50 to $15 a head, right, in the summer months. If we get into situations, we'll talk about those environments that create that, whether it's wet, flooding conditions for mosquitoes, or just other bedding and nesting areas of compost and manure situations where flies breed in. But even without trim loss, we do have reduced productivity from that. From an irritation standpoint, we have lower feed intake if pigs are not desiring to get up and go to a feeder, if they're being stressed from these pests. We have a decreased weight gain just with rubbing and irritation, the stress that's created there, fleeing to it. If there are certain regions in the barn that maybe the air is more stale and we get more flies, mosquitoes, that type of thing, they may just simply avoid some of that activity. So we're certainly expending energy there. The other thing to note, and I like to think about the dairy industry in this regards, is really reduced milk production, right? So reduction of lactation in sows because of their irritability. And the other thing to think about in lactation would be the spread of conditions like mastitis. Could go from udder to udder with transfer by bugs there. So it's really important there. There are a lot of stressors, and I think anytime we want to talk about disease, it's really a combination of stressors that add up here, impacting health and well-being. So increased costs, certainly a concern, whether it's the use of insecticides and biological products or chemical products to spend money on the control issue, but also we have a lot of management steps, right? Labor is certainly not readily available and cheap these days, but we take time to apply products. We take time to manage and control these breeding and bedding areas, whether that's outdoor compost sites, manure stockpiling, a whole lot of other lairage conditions. There's a lot of management that can go around. Now, I'd encourage you to keep on top of that because if we can get ahead of these populations, it's to our advantage. So veterinary costs, and certainly that would come into role if it was something that dealt with disease transmission later on down the road, and we saw some effects of pest transmitting disease and developing in those things. Feed wastage, obviously, if we have flies and you think of larvae or maggot conditions developing in feed, might be a condition there where we have some feed wastage as well. And then just the general revenue loss, right? So whether it's the carcass trim that we associated earlier, or carcass weight, if we're on a fixed time marketing window and we have reduced gain in those time periods as well. So, or it could be a revenue loss if we want to recover from insect bites in those last few weeks of marketing. And then I think it's also important to note just general nuisance concerns, right? So whether it's facility hygiene, the appearance there, just our own morale as a caretaker working in barns that have flies in the environment, things like that. And then being a good neighbor, right? Our social license to operate as far as community spread of flies. And we'll talk about that transmission just a little bit as well today. So next slide there, Chris. And so I think we'd be remiss in any topic of the industry not talking a little bit when we get talking about biosecurity for sure. And so bugs are really especially flies, more of a biosecurity concern than they are a carcass impact concern, right? They're a nuisance for sure, but of all the steps we do on a daily basis to do things right and to do improve our health on our farm, keeping these bugs out, which can be a potential vector, potential disease transmission agent, is very, very important. So flies and wool lump mosquitoes and midges and gnats and everything, they all are under the fly family. They're capable of really dispersing several miles, although they rarely occur at distances, say, greater than 1 to 2 miles from their origin site, their breeding location, unless they can find another nesting and breeding piece of that's generally found in decomposing matter, right? I like to call, all pathogens hitchhikers, right? And so flies are that. There's my own pickup truck heading down the road, and I've got fly in it, right? So what barn site? Where did that one originate from? Unknown, but is it going to get out and be a transmissible agent when we get to the next site? We don't know. Even our equipment and trucks and so forth certainly can transport these further than that 2 miles quite easily, even across state lines, right? So the other here to note is that not only do we think about the biting, so the blood transmission, depending on what species we're talking about, but the surface area of these insects and their regurgitated stomach contents or their feces, that's really laden with microorganisms and full of potential pathological disease, right? And so anytime you see speckling and spotting, think about on your tin, the black spots, the white tan, on windows, it's more of a pasty, chalky kind of a stuff, really sticky, right? It can stay around. So, and I note that we put down a handful of diseases on there, and this list can go on and on and on about what we can find that the fly does carry and insects do carry. But certainly PED and PRRS today are of notion, Seneca strep. And when we get into foreign animal diseases, which that list seems to grow nowadays, and Dr. Rademacher may be of interest to bring up some others that are going on, not just in the pork industry, but in other species and can kind of cross over, but they are carried through insects of some sort. So important to stay on top of these situations. Let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit about development of an integrated pest management program around your farm, and certainly it's something to be inclusive in anyone's SOPs about pest management and the biosecurity related to it. So the USDA does define very well, I think, and to the industry's advantage and education here, what integrated pest management is. In Iowa State and the Pork Center, we're doing a lot of work around this, not just in the bugs that we're going to talk about, but we're talking some educational pieces here related to several things. So a science-based, sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, environmental, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way that minimizes economic, health, and environmental risk here. So what I think is important to note is that it's important to overlay a lot of different practices and get very aggressive early in the season. I would say if we think about a sustainable approach to it, is identifying when can we impact that life cycle of the bug, and if we're thinking about populations of them in or around our farm, the earlier we can get on it in a season, if we understand that life cycle and the environmental conditions that fester and grow it, really important. So, and then just that overlaying of these practices is so important. So, for example, not just fogging the barn, and that controls kind of that adult population in there, but also controlling that breeding and nesting area outside, which are really the repopulation site, right? I've heard it said, and if you think about the maybe 6 stages of the life cycle of it, adult flies are really only about 15% of your fly population. So those adults that you see flying around in your airspace when you're in the barn, the pig space, that's only 15% of your potential flies. They're repopulating, they're growing. And so if we're just controlling those, they're going to keep coming back. And so that life cycle, and Dr. Rademacher will get into a little bit probably, but mosquitoes, they live 2 to 3 weeks. They complete their life cycle in probably 7 to 10 days, and it just continues. The females of a lot of these fly species can produce 600 to 900 eggs, for example, from one. So overlaying these things, thinking about the tools that exist there, whether it's chemical, we'll spend a lot of time on the pesticides, so it's fogging, topical application, baiting, feed-through products are really important within that. So let's talk a little bit more on the next slide here about some steps within your integrated pest management plan. Number one, we really have to identify what is that pest species, right? So that involves either Dr. Rademacher or I are entomologists, and so it involves bringing in an entomologist, getting specifically to what is our target pest. Mosquitoes, there's over 50 species of them, right? We're going to talk about a couple of them predominantly that might exist here in the upper Midwest seasonally, but there's well over 18,000 different species of various flies just in North America, and more than that across the globe, right? So if it's flies, for example, are we dealing with house flies, stable flies, black flies, fruit flies, face or horn flies, for example, in bovine species, gnats and midges. We don't have a midge here in the upper Midwest generally, but that's something coastal. They call them no-see-ums, right? Real pest. But what is it specifically? And so get some proper identification so that our practices for finding out where their breeding grounds are, and then also what products would work against them and what's the right timing to come in to destroy them, right? So let's monitor and assess some pest numbers, and we're going to show you some tools, whether it's a web-based tool to look at that that exists here, at least here for Iowa anyway, and assess kind of what's our population look like. And even seasonally, obviously, it changes. So guidelines for when management action is needed. So that's really an SOP, right? So when we get to a certain population or we trap so many of them in a trap, here's when we start overlaying some pesticides, for example. I can't stress enough the management of crusted manure, of decomposing feed, manure and mortality, stockpiles, avoiding stale air in the barns. Those types of things can be a lot of prevention pieces there. And again, just that combination or that overlaying of things, mechanical pieces of cleaning and doing that. So it's really, really important here with all these things. And the post-implementation, was that product we use effective? We really want to focus on those 3 weeks pre-marketing in the summertime to avoid insect damage. So where are we at in that process? Did it work? Was there a management step that we could have taken to avoid, spending money on an insecticide or a feed-through product or whatever it was to do these things? So hopefully we covered some things there that are kind of important, but I would consider not just developing an SOP or an integrated pest management program around avoiding carcass damages, but also look at biosecurity and other well-being considerations within the barn as well. So to I guess emphasize these things, we're going to bring you some real case situations that Dr. Rademacher's got some good information on, and I'll turn it over to him.
Very good. Thank you, Colin. Yeah, I mean, and we'll talk about kind of our progression. I'll be honest with you, I didn't really understand much about integrated pest management until a situation that happened last summer and the development of some tools and some documents that you can take home with you today. So Colin did a really nice job of giving you that very high level overview of how you would approach that. And what we'll try to do here today, and which I think is always helpful, I know for me anyway, is taking that concept and then seeing it in practice and something that we do day in and day out. So yeah, we've got a couple of case studies here. One that occurred last summer, which was really kind of the genesis of putting together a lot of this information and a lot of learning that we did here at the center. And then the second case was actually by a veterinary colleague, friend of mine, who had shared one with a different insect species, but it was very similar in the approach and how they resolved the situation. So So yeah, just to give you a little bit of background on where we wound up and how this process really got started for us, really started last summer in July. So we got a call from a prominent pig producer in the very northwest corner of Iowa on July 9th. So it was a Monday morning of 2024. And basically it was like, hey, we need help here. We've got the packer that I market some of my pigs to, we've been going back and forth. We've got a lot of these blemishes, and they're reporting issues at the plant, and some of them are our pigs, some are some others. What do we do about it, right? And it kind of coincided with some record rainfall that we had in late June and early July. So we kind of got a bunch of us on a conference call and included a representative from the packer and some other producers, and just talked about what they were seeing kind of in lairage and the carcasses. They were starting to monitor some of that information, and were really wonderful to share it. So they were just looking for, hey, do you guys have any resources that you can share with producers to kind of help us curb some of these issues that we were having at the plant with trim loss? As Colin mentioned earlier, there was some reports in a paper that was published a few years ago, like talked that, insect bites can vary anywhere from $7 to $15, per carcass during the summertime. So I think they were seeing all of that in this very situation. So the plant was excellent. They actually were tracking this and shared some of that information. So just to give you a little bit of perspective here about when exactly we were talking about. And just bear this in mind, because we went back to this calendar several times when we started to assess the insect we were dealing with and some of the data that was publicly available, which we'll share those resources with you as well. They really started to, see it, like I said, late June, early July, which is week 27. Week 28 was July 7th through the 13th, and week 29 was the 14th through the 20th of July. And you can see we got the call there on the second bar, which was July 9th. The plant was already reporting, up to a third or a little bit more of the loads that were being delivered to the plant, that they were having issues with affected pigs and affected carcasses. So you can see where that really kind of peaked. You see the weekend there of the 13th and the 14th, no pigs were killed, so there was no data collected at that time. And then they did start to see some resolution there afterwards. So kind of keep those dates, those weeks and those dates in mind as we go through that. So like I say, the plant was excellent in sharing some of that information. So really our goal was to try and figure out what we could put together in a very a quick amount of time. I mean, we didn't have any resources per se, but we were able to reach out to, really several different people and put something together. Here are some images from the plant. You can see a couple, the first two to the left were pigs that were in lairage, and then you see the next two images on the right there were pigs after going through the scalding tank. You can kind of see how extensive, both in terms of the number of pigs affected, and then the how extensively on individual carcasses they were impacted as well. So like we said, our goal really was, in a matter of days, was to try to develop a best practices document for the producers that were delivering to that packing plant, in an effort to do something to stave some of this off. So we really just got on the phone and started to phone a friend. We sent some information out through the ASV listserv that goes out to all the ASV members, American Association of Swine Veterinarians, to see what people were seeing, what things that they've done in the past to help ameliorate insect concerns. But Colin really mentioned probably where we learned the most and got the best information. And, I would say if there's one message to take home to you, if you find yourself in a similar situation this summer, is reach out to entomologists. They really are just a wealth of knowledge and can really help you pinpoint very quickly what you're dealing with. Because once you understand what you're dealing with and you understand the life cycle of those insects that you're dealing with, it becomes much easier to put that integrated pest management plan together and in place very rapidly. So we reached out to the USDA, some entomologists and their team. what we found was even in the allied industries, and we'll mention some people in the acknowledgments at the end of the call, they've got most of the companies that have products have absolutely fantastic entomologists on staff as well, and they're really great resources through their technical services teams as well. And then we reached out to some, farms and some production systems just to find out what they were doing. So we really were in a massive information gathering mode, and then tried to pare it down to put something together that producers could use literally in just a matter of days. So what we came up with, and with a little bit of revision and continues to revise as we go along, was the management of site insect levels to minimize carcass impact. So, and we've got that up now on the extension store. We had it on the Iowa Pork Industry Center website. That link is still there. If you've got a phone, you can dial in the QR code. It will take you to that document. And really, it was kind of a multifaceted approach to insect management. So really, it was, how do you take this integrated pest management program and apply it? So we're able to put that together very shortly. We had several entomologists kind of review it and kind of give us our blessing, making sure we were providing good, solid recommendations to be helpful. So that resource is out there for you, and we'll have that QR code available again at the end of the presentation as well. Or if you're watching it, you can obviously pause it and write that down and get to the information that way as well. So what did we really learn in that process? So Colin went through, USDA definition about integrated pest management, or IPM plans. I would say kind of the Cliff Notes version of that. It really can be done in about 3 steps. So the most important pieces of that is, number 1 is surveillance and identification. What you'll see here in a moment is, when you see these insect bites, you can't just look at the insect bite and determine the insect just from that alone. You're going to need to be able to do some surveillance, some traps, some capture methods, and then work with an entomologist to really get the insect and the actual species of that insect identified, to put together a good insect management, integrated pest management plan put together. The second important piece of that, certainly that we learned, was the impact of the environment, right? Most of these insects go through eggs and larval stages and pupal stages before they get to the adults, right? So understanding and looking for that environment, as Colin said, I think the default is always, okay, well, we got insects, we got to start fogging the barn. Well, you're only catching 10 to 15% of the adult population, and most of those chemicals are only going to get the ones that are in the air at the time that you spray it. So unless you're doing that consistently, you're only knocking out, 1 out of every 10 that you're going to be dealing with. So you've really got to think about taking a more holistic approach to get you through, the current situation that you find yourself in. And so much of that can be done just by really looking for the environment. So, in terms of those that, nest in or go through their larval in pupal stages in standing water, for example, with mosquitoes, that's assessing it, getting rid of, that water where you can find it, assessing it for larvae if it is an area where you can't, utilizing products that may inhibit those larvae from developing into the pupae and the adult stages are very important pieces to that. Looking at the vegetation surrounding the buildings, for certain species that Colin mentioned before, there's like 50 different species of mosquitoes that can impact livestock and humans, right? So certain ones, they have to have rest and shade, or they can desiccate, and some of those, that can just be grass up and around the building. Some of them can be trees, nearby. So that's once again why the speciation of exactly what you're dealing with is so important. And then making some ventilation adjustments. We worked with Dr. Brett Ramirez, one of our agriculture engineers, to be thinking about, ways we could impact the environment from that standpoint. And then the third leg really on that stool is the chemical mitigation, as Colin said, that really knocks down that adult population that you're dealing with. The big key that we got and heard this consistently from the entomologists is You can't wait until you have a problem to start doing something about it, though. So you've really got to be proactive in trying to think about this ahead of time. Now, obviously, we can have insect bites at any time, but the real problem usually doesn't raise its head until we start sending pigs to market and we start getting pigs that are rejected, or you start suffering trim loss, right? That's when people start to really notice it when it hits the bottom line. So these are the type of things that you got to start to be thinking about, preferably this time of year now before we even get into it, but certainly before we get into that marketing phase. That's the sort of things you want to start thinking about surveillance. You want to start looking in the environment. What are areas, that I can do, that I can control any potential pests and their, development. And then, using the chemical mitigation when we hit that threshold that Colin mentioned about where we need to do something to knock the adult population down. So as we said, engaging an entomologist, was extremely important. Understanding that types were going to dictate the mitigation strategies, and then utilizing the different traps out. So in this situation, we're able to work with a couple of different companies. There's different options for traps that were out there. CDC has light traps, which use CO2 or dry ice as an attractant. That was in the cases of mosquitoes, that worked very well. There's New Jersey light traps, which really aren't indiscriminate. They're going to attract all sorts of insects. And knowing how cost conscious our producers are, one way that one of the USDA entomologists came up with is like, well, heck, just get some of those vertical fly strips or sticky cards and put them in the barns, so it can be as simple as hanging it in 5 to 10 different places in the barns. And we kind of asked, well, where's the best place to do that? He said, well, just look where the spider webs are, because spiders are putting their webs where they think the insects are going to be. So that's kind of a neat, very practical way to, and very inexpensive way to do some of that surveillance. And then, once you're able to collect those insects, either you can send them off, or in some cases you can just, take some high definition, photos or images and send them off to the entomologist too, and they can assist you with the proper identification as well. But getting that entomologist involved in the front side, will certainly help. They'll be able to tell you, what's going on in the area. Here's the type of traps that I think you should use, and set them up. And then here's how I want you to get that information back to me. So lo and behold, in our case, unbeknownst to us, we suspected we were dealing with mosquitoes only because as we started to talk to some of the entomologists, they had shared with the record rainfall, there was a lot of standing water, certainly around in that area. They were starting to hear complaints, certainly as well. So as we started to look towards some of our internal resources as well, unbeknownst to us until we got digging into this, Iowa State University and their Department of Entomology actually does some Iowa mosquito surveillance on a year-to-year basis. So the QR code that you see in the upper right-hand corner there will take you to this website, and they do it in several different counties throughout Iowa. And what I thought was really neat about it, and there'll be another thing here where they'll speciate the actual mosquitoes that they're finding here in a second, was just looking at overall trends. And the neat part about that is we looked at what we were currently seeing in 2024 and then got to compare that to a year before, back in 2023. So for those of you who maybe aren't from Iowa, 2023 was really a pretty extremely dry year. Most of the state was kind of in a drought or near drought condition. So because of that, you can see that the mosquito counts with the blue line there were very, very low. But as you can see, and starting in weeks, early even in 23, 24, 25, but certainly hitting a peak in 27 when we start talking about having the higher amounts of rainfall, you can see this massive explosion in the mosquito counts right during the time period before we started, the plant started reporting issues with the carcasses. So you can kind of see that overlays and correlates, pretty nicely there. Another feature of this website, as you'll see on the next slide, is not only do they count them, but then they'll go ahead and speciate them as well. And you can see of the different mosquitoes there, we've got several different species. So we went ahead on this producer and did some trapping with that. And I took a little clipping from what they found in the most abundance in the trapping that was done at this producer's site, probably a couple of days after we'd gotten the phone call. And then the one that we found most often was Culex tarsalis. So and it was interesting. So we kind of looked up and was provided some feedback a little bit about that species. That was the most common one that we found on that site. And you can see it ranked about 4th in the species abundance on the Iowa mosquito surveillance. But some interesting things about Culex tarsalis. It's a very aggressive and painful day biter associated with animal congregation areas, including farm production settings, prone to entering structures when seeking a blood meal, opportunistic feeders of many vertebrate species, and strong flyers that can travel over 2 miles seeking a host. So all things that are bad for livestock producers for sure, right? In natural habitats, they exclusively feed on birds, but in agriculture and developed habitats, then they broaden their selection to feed on humans and livestock. So so very aggressive type, and that was the most common one that we found on the traps in the farm during that time period. So as we got then into starting to visit the sites, talk to some of the producers putting this together, we wanted to start thinking about what are some of the integration plans that we can put together. And so one of the things in terms of managing the environment, we looked at standing water. So, we can do that, by just kind of doing a perimeter walk. Now it's a little bit tough with Culex tarsalis, as you saw, because they can really travel for a long ways, right? But most of them tend to be a lot closer to that. So, just walking around, doing visual inspection, looking for any standing water, that can easily be eliminated, so like, they talk about, tires, or like in a barn, it would be a curtain pocket, making sure there isn't standing water sitting there, draining, filling in, divots on the farm, things like that. In bigger ponds of water that aren't easy to eliminate the water, then you start looking for the larvae there. So you see a couple of pictures there of what they call the wriggler, or the mosquito larvae. You start looking for them. If you start to see, ponds or areas that have that, there are, and you have the ability and the legal rights to treat them. You can treat them with a couple of different products. There's a bacillus species of bacteria, which is a more natural way, or methoprene is another product that both of those will impact that larvae's ability to develop into pupae. So from a site maintenance standpoint, what are some of the things you can do to manage the environment? Making sure you have a good rock barrier that facilitates good water drainage around the facility, keeping weed growth, down, keeping the grass short around the facilities, because some of those species do require shelter to prevent desiccation. So keeping all that short and trim, and then, just making sure curtain pockets are not retaining either rain or, running misters. If there's misters inside the building, that they're not accumulating, water there that allows the opportunity for, mosquitoes larvae to develop in there as well. So in terms of looking at from a ventilation standpoint, we asked the plant, were they tracking some of this information, and they weren't tracking it directly, but anecdotally, it seems like more of the problems were occurring in the naturally ventilated buildings than the power tunnel ventilated buildings. So, some of the recommendations you can be thinking about from the natural barn standpoint is, making sure all your stir fans work, and then keeping them on during the nighttime during, peak seasons by lowering the stir fan on time and off time, making those adjustments there. Tunnel barns, another potential adjustment there is just keeping them, in tunnel during the nighttime, just so that we don't have this dead period there, making sure that all those curtains are the tunnel curtains are working and adjusted properly. And then ensuring that those misters, water sprinklers, that they're properly adjusted and functioning, so they're not creating standing waters in any area of the buildings as well. The third piece of that then was certainly the chemical mitigation. We're talking about the pesticides. So, I was just stressing again, they're certainly going to be a part of the integrated pest management, but The most important piece is they're not the whole integrated pest management for the reasons that Colin laid out. Spraying for the adults is going to be the least effective. We've got to eliminate those breeding sites as well. If we look at the chemical mitigation, there's really two primary categories there. You have the non-residual contact sprays. So that's usually the sprays that you can put in the environment and actually get on the animals. That's generally accepted, but you need to make sure that you check the label. It must be labeled for that. So I know for my veterinary friends and colleagues, we're used to doing off-label on certain stuff. Well, when you're dealing with the EPA, there is no such thing as off-label. So you have to use products explicitly as how it's stated to be used on the label. Residual sprays, just as they sound, you can treat areas and you're going to get a longer lasting mitigation there, but you're going to treat the resting places in and around the facility. But in all cases, you absolutely cannot get those on the animal. It's just for treating the environment. So once again, I just clipped this from that document that you had earlier. Once again, you must follow the label directions. Just want to make sure we don't walk away without stating that today. It's a violation of state and federal law to use any pesticides in any manner that's different from the product label. So make sure you're looking at the product labels. Most of these are in the pyrethrin, the permethrin class. So they get those from the chrysanthemum flowers. So they're, fairly natural products. So you've got the different examples. We tried to develop a comprehensive list of what we thought was out there. I'm sure it's not all inclusive though. So just making sure that if you're looking at those, you're looking at the active ingredients with the different method of action group as well. So once again, that's all in the document that we had earlier. Some of the fogging devices that we found that people were using with really good success with those oil or water-based pyrethrins, for spraying the buildings that were infested with adults. Here's a couple of different options there for utilizing those products and fogging inside the buildings themselves. The residual sprays, as we said, that's the other chemical mitigation. So there you're actually looking to spray the resting surfaces. So in many cases with certain species, they're going to fly inside the building, but they're going to need a place to rest. So you're going to actually treat the resting surfaces, once again, being very careful not to get any on the animals. And if that's something that you're doing somewhat consistently, you see we've got a list of the different active ingredients in the mechanism of action group. You want to make sure that you're doing some rotation of those groups to reduce the probability of developing resistance to any one of those as well. So that was a little bit on the case of the mosquito integrated pest management plan. That document that you have can be used for other. It's primarily mosquito based because that was what we were dealing with last summer, but the concepts and principles are pretty similar and pretty sound to use. So we wanted to give you a little bit different look at another case with a different insect here on the second case. So in the second case here, you can see these slides were provided by Dr. Scanlon Daniels in his practice area. So they had reported some increased trim loss from the packing plant during the summer after an increase in rainfall, so similar to our last case. And then upon inspection out in the field, they had multiple barns of pigs reported to have skin lesions. You see some of the photos there. So you can see, as compared to the previous case, the bites all look very same and similar, right? So at least in the barn or in larage, they're going to look pretty similar. You see these little red raised papules all over the body of these animals. So going back to our integrated pest management protocol again, the first step is surveillance, right? We had to figure out what we were dealing with. So they went in and did some facility and animal audits. They noted that there were, definitely some flies in the buildings. They set up some sticky traps and then sent those traps on to an entomologist for the proper identification. So in this case, we were dealing with the stable fly. That's what they've tended to find here. So what's the difference between stable flies and house flies, right? Because we all see flies in our barns. What's the difference between the two of them? They both certainly are pests, as Colin alluded to earlier on in the webinar, but there are some important distinctions between the two. Stable flies, you can see the little blue arrow there on the top, certainly are, can be, they have kind of this biting proboscis up here, right? So it's a little bit hard to tell in this picture here, but they have the ability to kind of penetrate the skin with that proboscis. So they're more biting. They feed on the blood of animals, where houseflies, they really are feeding on, they have non-biting proboscis on theirs. You don't really see the sharp pointed on their head piece there. So that's kind of the difference there. They're going to feed on dead and decaying material versus doing the biting. From an identification standpoint, you can see the housefly is a little bit bigger than the stable fly. If you look at getting close enough to it, you can see stable flies kind of have this checkered abdomen there, kind of a grayish brown body, whereas the housefly is kind of the dull gray with these 4 distinct dark stripes on the back of the thorax. The habitats, are a little bit different, so that gets to be important when we think about our environment and our integrated pest management. For stable flies, so part of the reason why they got their name is they found them around horse stables, right? They're actually looking for barns with kind of organic matter. So they're not necessarily going to lay it in fresh feces, but they're looking for, rotting vegetation. So you'd think about stables, you'd have a mixture of hay and feces and manure, so that were kind of rotting. It's got to get to that advanced stage. That's where they're looking to lay their eggs. Whereas, habitat for houseflies, barns, office, anywhere with any organic material, they're going to lay their eggs, anywhere and everywhere. Life cycles and lifespans are fairly similar. A couple other kind of differences to note, which were kind of interesting, was how they rest. If you look at stable flies, as they're resting on surfaces, they tend to rest with their head a little higher than their abdomen, so almost like a tilt, or kind of like if they were dragging their tails on the ground a little bit. And houseflies actually rest parallel to the ground, which was the last thing is where they rest inside of a facility, which is really interesting and got to be very important. We looked at it from a mitigation standpoint. Stable flies actually rest within 3 feet of the ground, so it became a really good target for utilizing residual sprays, whereas houseflies, as you've seen them, they can rest anywhere, and they especially seem to like high surfaces. So just some important differences to highlight between those 2 different species groups. So the house and stable fly life cycles, they both have the same. They have an egg. They have 3 different larval stages. Eventually, they then will form a pupae after that 3rd larval stage, and then the adults hatch from the pupal stage. So as they kind of did an evaluation of their surroundings, what they found was the barns that were most severely affected were near some cattle feed yards that had happened to be in the area. And they had multiple piles of rotting straw in fields that were adjacent to some of the worst affected sites. So you can see some pictures there, right? So once we knew, stable flies, they prefer the rotting vegetation. You can see where, okay, now we've identified an area that we can do something about, right? So simply, getting that removed and moved away from the buildings was going to be effective in our integrated pest management strategy. What did we know a little bit about the sites that were insect bites is, predominant, all the buildings in that were all naturally ventilated finishing buildings, right? So we knew, they were gonna have open, kind of unfettered access to the animals. So because we knew we were dealing with stable flies, and we knew that they preferred to rest 3 feet from the ground, we knew that was going to allow us to utilize residual pesticides kind of in that target zone outside of the building. So you can see there, kind of on that previous slide, their preferred resting area is going to be right there. So the farms then applied that residual disinfectant in that barrier in an area that the pigs couldn't get to, but that the stable flies preferred to rest in. So kind of the 4th step there that Colin mentioned in that plan is kind of the post-implementation effectiveness. So they went ahead and moved a lot of that rotting vegetation where they could go ahead and move it. They applied the residual disinfectant. They went back and then did some additional facility and animal audits. They did some index cards. some biting fly traps, and then obviously we're monitoring the amount of carcasses affected at the packing plant, and they all showed a significant decrease after they went in and applied those measures. So just kind of another, different insect, but kind of the same practice and case, evaluation and how you approach that process, and thinking through the life cycle and where we can put multiple mitigation steps in those different layers to improve that insect outcome. So really kind of in summary here, before we go to the Q&A session here, once again, we've got the QR code that brings us to access to that document. So integrated pest management is key. And, the big key that I think we want you to walk away with today is you need to really be thinking about that and work with your growers, particularly if you're dealing with contract growers, start talking to them about those sorts of things in advance. Certainly advance of the summer now, and then certainly as we get close to the marketing time period, focusing on those sites. Utilize your resources and get them involved early in the process. Like we say, engaging the entomologists, certainly from the technical service staff companies, they were extremely invaluable in giving us some real practical, day in, day out knowledge, and helped us develop some pieces for that document. That best practice guide is available, and it continues to be updated as new information is obtained. That one that we have there is, primarily for mosquitoes, could certainly be applied to the stable flies. We're in the process of developing insect-specific guides currently, and we'll continue to add those as they get developed. Want to do some acknowledgments real quickly. So Dr. Greiner and I and Dr. Ramirez, really, we were the ones, out meeting and talking to people and tried to put that document together inside of a week. So I wanted to make sure to acknowledge them. Dr. Lee Kronstadt is an entomologist with USDA. He's actually the co-author on our document, and he was a fantastic wealth of knowledge, as well as Dr. Cantangui from MWI Animal Health, who's their entomologist. The team from Central Life Sciences, they actually were good enough to go out to one of our sites and help us do some of the trapping and help us put some of the finer point pieces on that document. The Elanco Insect Pest Management team, obviously Dr. Daniels, and then Dwight Mogler from Pig Hill Farms. So with that, I appreciate your attention today, and Colin and I will take any questions that you may have come in. Stacy, just a reminder, if you want, you can unmute yourself to ask your question, or you can just put your question in the chat box and we'll be happy to get to it.
Yeah, thank you, Chris and Colin. So what would be the biggest takeaway from this? So what is the most important thing do you think producers should do to prepare for the upcoming insect season?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest thing is to think about it ahead of time. I think, and a lot of that is just looking at the environment. If we think about here in the upper Midwest, thinking about flies, thinking about mosquitoes, thinking about where the breeding and nesting grounds would be. So, but trying to do that, as best practices, trying to keep your site well maintained, clean up your feed spills, make sure things are properly, rocked, making sure your grasses are mowed. And then, if you're in an area that had a lot of trees nearby, you just need to be cognizant that, if we start to get insect trouble, that may be something that we have to pay attention to. I think a part of it too is, as the growers are going through the buildings and they notice insect bites, but let's say we're 6 weeks out from marketing, now's the time to start putting that, plan together, engage an entomologist, do some surveillance, find out what you're dealing with. So that way you can put your plan in place and get those insect bites taken care of, rather than, before you get to the point where you're starting to market those animals. Because, those insects don't wait till just find the pigs a week before marketing, right? If they're there, they're going to be, impacting pigs of, all ages, preferably. So if you see them, I think the biggest thing is just, start dealing with it, start addressing it now. Don't wait until marketing and you start getting calls from the packer, you're seeing trim loss, that they think that you're having to deal with it. What do you think about that, Colin? You got any comment?
Yeah, I would say proactive would be my number one statement too, right? And sometimes you can either look back seasonally on your previous conditions, either at the packing plant or just in production standpoint, from year to year, and say, well, or something. They seem to hit us in August or wherever it is, and then certainly when you start having heavy rainfall events and flooding's going to come downstream, such as we had in Clay County last year or something like that, right? The other piece to note about pests, and we didn't talk much about from a reproductive standpoint, but generally think about the fact that we're in an industry community, and that sow herd is something we really want to protect, right? And so not from the carcass standpoint, but just other transmissible disease that can occur. So knocking down populations in general would really help. And we didn't tackle other species. For example, Chris, put on your DVM hat, right? And you might be able to update us a little bit on things like Japanese encephalitis virus, which is mosquitoes and really can impact the sow reproductively, from abortions to mummified fetuses and stillborns, weak pigs. Boar fertility is affected, I understand. So there, and then non-pig specific, I see we have a question in the chat related to screwworm, right? So about what's the next thing for us.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Megan asked that question. Hi, Dr. Bolin. I appreciate the question. Colin and I did go back and forth about whether or not we were going to invest some time to add a couple of slides on New World screwworm, but I figured we were going to run out of time with what we had, and then I did see that SHIC and ASV are going to have a webinar here in a couple of weeks. But yeah, one of the things that we will be updating will be New World screwworm. So for people who may not know what that is, so that is, it actually causes damage to the carcass. It's a fly species, but instead of laying in a manure or rotting vegetation, it actually lays its eggs in flesh. But it doesn't differentiate rotting flesh between dead and live animals, right? So it can get in, bites on the skin of, any livestock and even in people, right? So that's the one that's kind of been stuck in the jungles of Panama, but now with, some deforestation, it's starting to move up through Mexico, and we're trying to get ahead of it with some sterile male fly insertions into that population. That's how it's been eradicated in the past. But it's kind of on Mexico. It's in southern Mexico now, but working on its way to do that. So yeah, we'll plan on that. Will be one of the fact sheets, and depending on how far that gets, that may be dedicated to its own webinar as well. I know Dr. Simmons is going to speak. I had the opportunity to hear her speak in a session I was in Washington, D.C. about a month ago. And yeah, I'd tell you what, I had nightmares that night. So, I mean, it's a real and present threat, and certainly integrated pest management is going to be an important piece of that as well.
Thank you both. We're at time. I see a question did come in. This is recorded, so everybody that registered for this will get an email when the video is ready in YouTube, and you can distribute that to your growers. We would encourage that. We appreciate that. And then also, yeah, if you have any questions, Chris, Colin, our resources here in the Pork Center. So happy to help if any questions come up that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I'd say is, you bet, if you would like Colin or I to come and give this presentation at a grower meeting or a clinic meeting, we'd be more than happy to do that for our producers here in the Upper Midwest as well. Thank you. Really appreciate you guys attending today.
Yep. Thank you.